So to really get into our orientation, we're going to start off with understanding how dogs learn. And dogs learn just like the rest of us, whether we be a dog or a human being or a polar bear or a dolphin or a monkey. Um, we all learn through consequences that happen in our environment. We use scientific terms in class, so these terms come directly from behavioural science, which is a stream of psychology. Um, and these ideas are the idea of reinforcement, of punishment, and of the extinction of behaviours. So, to reinforce something is essentially a consequence happens that increases the likelihood of a behaviour repeating itself. Okay, so that means something happens if the dog sits, for example, and a treat comes. The likelihood of the dog sitting again to repeat the treat occurring increases in statistical probability. So that just means, obviously, if my dog sits, I give it a cookie, it's more likely to sit again. For the idea of punishment, so people have a lot of baggage with the term punishment. We think of probably the most violent things, but again, we're using it as a scientific term, so it has a particular meaning. So we have to put our baggage aside for a minute and understand that punish or punishment means a consequence happens that decreases the likelihood of a behaviour repeating itself. So, for example, my dog jumps up on me and I turn around and I don't give my dog any attention, then the likelihood of my dog jumping up on me to get my attention is obviously going to decrease in probability. Then you have a third term. The third term is what most people have never heard of. So we've got reinforcement, we've got punishment. The third term is called extinction. You may have heard of it in relation to dinosaurs, but most people don't know of it in relation to behaviour. So an extinction means there's no consequence. And because there's no consequence, the behaviour actually just disappears. An example of extinction when we're using it with dog training is for a dog that does what we call counter surfing. So a dog that might hop up to a counter to attempt to get food or some other item off the counter, that's counter surfing. So when the dog hops up on the counter, if there's never an opportunity for them to take something, if there's never any food or any other item on the counter, then the behaviour is actually going to disappear. And if you think about this in terms of in the wild, if I was trying to, for example, maybe hunt a rat as a dog, and I went and dug a hole where a rat would normally live, but there was no rat in there, if I did that a number of times, there was obviously going to be a less likelihood that I would continue to dig in holes if I never got a result from it. So what happens is that dog learns that holes aren't a way to get a rat. So the behaviour actually disappears. I'll no longer use digging at holes as a way to get a rat. They're always trying to figure out what works. So in a home setting, we can help them figure out what works and get the appropriate response that we want. So we've got, again, reinforcement, we've got punishment, and we've got extinction of behaviours. So a behaviour, just to clarify, is pretty much anything that we do is a behaviour. So me talking to you is a behaviour, your dog sniffing your shoe is a behaviour. Any action that we carry out is a behaviour. So these terms are all in relation to how they influence a behaviour. We then start to add another couple of terms on as well. These terms are the term positive and negative. Again, these are scientific terms, so we have, once again, another couple of terms that people have baggage with. Generally, positive we see as good, and negative we see as bad, but it's neither of those things. So positive is when something is added. Think of it as in mathematics, so it's a plus sign. Positive is a plus, and negative is just when something is removed. So again, it's more like a subtracting or a minus sign in maths than something that's particularly bad. So we start to add those terms together. We can start to see positive, so adding something, reinforcement, adding something to make a behaviour repeat itself. So we actually do focus on reinforcing behaviours that we want to see with desirable outcomes, obviously. So we get more reliable behaviours quicker and easier than we would if we were trying to stop a dog from doing something in particular. What we're going to ask you to do at this stage of training is, if your dog makes a mistake, we'd like you to ignore it. It's the most effective way of making a behaviour disappear, as we discussed with extinction before. And what we really need to take away from this element when we're talking about reinforcement, punishment, and extinction is that pretty much with pet dogs, anytime a behaviour is acknowledged, it is reinforced. So, barking is a prime example. A dog barks, person yells out the window, "Rover, shut up!" But we might see the dog stop in that moment in time, but we don't see an effective change of behaviour over a long period of time from that kind of reaction. And that is because generally the dog sees you barking as joining in. So the yelling is just joining in. And therefore, you've actually reinforced that behaviour. So whenever that next situation that happens that's the same, that makes the dog want to bark, he's definitely going to do it, especially if you have acknowledged it. So take that away first and foremost. Anytime you acknowledge a behaviour from your dog, the odds are you're actually reinforcing it, even if you think you're punishing it. This slide that you're looking at now is just a different representation of what we just ran through. So it is just saying that we're either looking at increasing a behaviour or decreasing a behaviour. That's all we're ever doing in training. We either want someone to repeat a good thing more and more, or we're looking at them to stop a bad thing more and more. Obviously, when we're training, we are looking at building trust with the dog. So to do that, we are going to use desirable consequences. You can also train using undesirable consequences, but that may have an impact on your relationship with your dog. And it generally means that you're going to have to constantly use some kind of force or intimidation or a bad experience for your dog to go through to manipulate its behaviours. And that's one thing that we want to avoid in class. So what you find by using reinforcement by using desirable consequences is that we actually get faster and accurate and more reliable results. And just because obviously we all kind of move towards the things that we want, so we will repeat behaviours that we need to do to get what we want. And the dog will do the same thing. As we said, they figure out how things work and they will repeat it to continue to get those things to work. We also do use a form of punishment. So if we can, again, punishment is to decrease the likelihood of a behaviour happening. The punishment that we use is called negative punishment. So it sounds like the worst kind of punishment, but again, all we're doing is taking away the opportunity to get a desirable consequence to stop a behaviour from happening. So as we said before, the prime example is if your dog jumps up at you and you give your dog no attention, so that's no talking, touching or eye contact, then you will start to see that behaviour dissipate, as long as you then follow it up with some kind of reinforcement when the behaviour that you want happens. So with the jumping up dog, once they've got 4 paws on the floor, we forget about the jumping up and we start to praise the dog and give attention to the dog on that level. Again, if you see in the middle, we see that extinction where there's no consequence that happens, the behaviour is unlikely to reappear. And it is an important part of pet dog training that we start to understand that sometimes we need to ignore things that are happening to make behaviours disappear, especially when it's got to do with attention building, such as if you're crate training a dog or teaching a dog to be alone by itself, then they might whine and things along those lines. You want to not reward that behaviour with attention, but ignore it so it does go away.